They say history is not what happened, but what someone chose to remember. And more often than not, what is remembered is not the truth, but a version, sanded smooth, washed of blood, folded neatly into silence. Clara Rowan had spent most of her life inside libraries, hushed rooms lined with the dust of centuries. She thought she understood silence. But this was different. This silence was heavy. It pressed against her ribs, as if it were alive. The diocesan archives in Dublin had always been closed to casual eyes. To enter, Clara needed letters of recommendation, credentials, and the calm authority of her historian's voice. Even then, the keepers of those shelves watched her every movement. They weren't hostile, just guarded, as though one wrong step might wake something they wished to keep asleep. She told them she was researching Irish orphanages in the 19th century. That much was true, but her reason was older, more personal. Her great-grandmother, a woman she had known only through sepia photographs, had spent her childhood in one of those places. A thin girl, hair plaited tightly, eyes too wide for her face. Clara never knew what was done to her there, nor why she never spoke of it. The family whispered around the subject as though even memory could wound. Now, deep within the archives, Clara's gloved fingers traced the rough edges of a leather-bound ledger. On its cover, no title, just a year, 1834. Inside, her eyes met neat columns of ink, admissions, expenses, deaths, names scratched out, margins left bare. It was the kind of book that did not shout. It whispered, and what it whispered was wrong. In one entry she found the words "an unfortunate tragedy, St. Brigid's orphanage, the fires of purity, 127. Nothing else. No detail. No account. Just that chilling phrase. Her breath caught. She whispered it aloud without meaning to. The fires of purity. It did not sound like record-keeping. It sounded like a ritual. She turned more pages, but the hand grew colder. The words clipped, evasive. Letters between priests followed. She found one line repeated across them. This matter is not to be revisited. The past has been purified. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she read. This was not history. This was a burial. She looked up across the narrow table and noticed that one of the parish archivists was watching her. His expression was unreadable, his lips pressed thin. When she closed the book and asked about St. Brigid's cell, he did not answer. He only shook his head slowly, like a man turning from the sight of a grave. Later that afternoon she asked another official, a woman kind-eyed but stern, whether the orphanage still stood. The woman stiffened at the question. "It is not spoken of," she said. "But why?" Clara pressed. "What happened there?" The woman only gave her a look that was part warning, part pity. "For your own good, leave that place in peace." Clara went back to her small flat in Rathmines that evening, with her satchel heavy with notes. She could not let it go. History had always been a puzzle to her, pieces scattered across time. But this puzzle was different. This one had been deliberately broken. As the rain tapped against her window, she spread the ledgers across her desk. She copied down the strange phrase again and again, the fires of purity. She stared at the number 127. It seemed to pulse in her mind, like a tolling bell. Who were they? What did it mean? And why was the church so determined to cover it? She thought of her great-grandmother again, the girl with hollow eyes, the woman who never spoke of her childhood. Was she one of the 127, or was she one who survived when others did not? That night, Clara could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the number etched behind her eyelids. 127. Not a statistic, not a mistake, a weight of flesh and bone. By morning she knew she had no choice. She would have to follow this trail, wherever it led. But already the air around her seemed to resist. At a cafe near the cathedral, she asked an elderly man if he remembered St. Brigid's cell. He dropped his teacup. The porcelain shattered on the tiles. He muttered an apology, but when she repeated the question, he looked at her with something close to terror. "No one calls it that," he whispered. "Not anymore. Best you done dat anymore. Best you done dat either." Others were the same. A shopkeeper turned pale and changed the subject. A cab driver refused to take her near the grounds. Children, when they overheard the name, went quiet, as if scolded by unseen hands. It was as if the very syllables carried a curse. Back in the archives, Clara found more fragments. A receipt for oil, more than any orphanage could reasonably need. A gap in the ledger, pages torn out, edges jagged. A final letter, unsigned, that read only, "They will not be remembered." That is mercy. But mercy to whom? To the dead, or to the living who carried the guilt? The pieces unsettled her. They didn't fit into a neat story yet. They resisted her historian's instincts, and that resistance itself was a clue. It meant someone had tried to hide something too large to erase, something fire could not burn away. As evening fell, Clara found herself standing outside the wrought-iron gates of the old diocesan grounds, staring into the distance where the orphanage once stood. The building had been razed decades ago, they said, but she could feel it still. An absence that hummed, a void that seemed louder than presence. A crow settled on the gatepost and croaked once, as if in warning. Clara tightened her scarf. The night air cut like glass, and she thought she could almost hear children's voices carried on the wind, not playful but pleading. She told herself it was only imagination, the effect of long hours and too much ink. Yet the feeling lingered. Whatever had happened in 1834 was not finished. It lived on, in silence, in whispers, in the number 127, and in her blood. Because if her great-grandmother had been there, then this was not just history, it was an inheritance. Clara looked down at her notebook, the words "fires of purity" written over and over in her hand, as if to fix them against being forgotten again. She whispered into the cold air, almost without knowing she spoke. What could burn so brightly that the world itself still refuses to look at the ashes? And so I will ask you, the listener, if you uncovered such words buried for nearly 2 centuries, would you close the book and leave them there, or would you keep reading, knowing some truths can never be unlearned? History does not always turn on wars or kings. Sometimes it turns on smaller lives, the ones never recorded, never remembered, yet broken all the same. Their cries do not echo in books, but in the walls of the places that confined them. In the year 1832, St. Brigid's orphanage stood at the edge of Kilmore village, a structure as severe as its purpose. The villagers called it the fortress, and they were not wrong. Grey stone, high walls, windows set narrow and deep, as though sunlight itself were unworthy to enter. The building squatted on the hill like a warning, a thing meant not to shelter children, but to contain them. Inside, the children moved like shadows, thin, pale, hollow-eyed, their clothes patched with more stitch than fabric. They had no family left but each other, and so they clung to fragile bonds, an older boy shielding a younger sister, holding hands even in sleep. The quiet comfort of breath beside breath in the long dormitory rows. They were not allowed to laugh too loudly. They were not allowed to ask too much. And yet, as children always do, they whispered of the things adults pretended not to hear. Over them watched Brother O'Connell, the overseer, a man of iron voice and hard eyes. He believed discipline was salvation, that hunger carved humility, that suffering scrubbed away sin. His leather strap was not for correction, but for purification. To him, the children were not wards, they were offerings. And then there was Sister Agnes, young, barely out of novitiate, her face pale as if still learning how to belong in such a place. Her voice was soft, her movements measured, and though she rarely spoke, her silence said more than her words could. She followed the rules. Yes, she bowed to Brother O'Connell's authority, but in her eyes lingered unease like a flame trapped behind glass, flickering against smothering dark. The chapel was the heart of St. Brigid Sem. At night, when the bells struck, the children were marched inside. Rows of small bodies knelt before the altar, while the air thickened with incense. To most, incense was the smell of devotion. But here the scent was different, darker, acrid, threaded with something greasy, like burning fat. The smoke clung to their clothes, their hair, their lungs. And the prayers. Oh, the prayers were strange. They began with the familiar litanies, words the children had learned by rote. But then Brother O'Connell would lower his voice, and the Latin shifted. The rhythm became wrong, too heavy, too hungry. Words the children did not understand, yet felt in their marrow. Sister Agnes would bow her head then, lips pressed tightly shut. The whispers spread quickly through the dormitory. Some said the prayers were not to God but to fire. Others claimed the smoke itself was alive, curling into shapes above the altar when no adult looked. And then there were the older children, the ones who disappeared. The nuns told them not to worry, that the chosen ones had ascended, that they had been blessed with purity and gone to a higher place. But the beds left empty did not feel like blessings. They felt like graves. No child who ascended was ever seen again. Their names were not spoken. Their possessions, what little they had, were taken away, burned or locked in a chest the children never dared to open. The younger ones asked where they had gone. The older ones learned not to ask. But at night, in whispers they told stories that the ascents were taken beneath the chapel, into the crypt where the torches never went out, that their cries could be heard faintly if you pressed your ear against the floorboards, that the smell in the air was not incense at all. One boy, Sian, small for his age but with eyes sharp as glass, swore he saw a figure carried into the chapel one midnight when the others were meant to be asleep, wrapped in white cloth, limp, unbreathing. He told the others in a whisper that shook as much as his body, "They don't go to heaven. They go to the fire." The next morning, Sian Seb's bed was empty. The children pretended not to notice. They learned that noticing was dangerous, that remembering could bring the same fate, and so they made their silence into armor and hoped silence would make them invisible. But children are not good at silence. Their fears spill out in whispers, in glances, in the way their small hands grip each other too tightly when Brother O'Connell walks by. Sister Agnes noticed. Her gaze lingered on the thin wrists, the bruises that discipline left behind, the way the children shrank from shadows. She began leaving scraps of bread under pillows. She lingered in the dormitory after prayers, her candle low as though her presence alone could guard them. Yet she never spoke against what was happening. Her silence was both shield and chain. And outside, in Kilmore village, the people whispered too. They noticed the smoke that rose from the orphanage chimneys at odd hours of the night. They noticed the children who entered the gates and were never seen again, but they told themselves it was not their concern. Better not to interfere with the church. Better not to invite its wrath. So they turned their eyes away, and in turning away they became complicit. Nearly 2 centuries later, Clara Rowan's eyes traced these accounts in testimony. Pages brittle, ink faded, but the voices were still alive. She read of the chapel nights, the strange prayers. The smell was not incense, the ascensions that were vanishings. She pressed her hand against the page and felt as though the shadows of those children pressed back through time. Every detail she uncovered was like walking deeper into their dormitory, hearing their whispers in the dark. And the question grew heavier in her chest: what truly happened to those children? The church had written only of purity. The villagers had chosen silence. The orphans had vanished. But the walls of St. Brigid's had been remembered. And now through these pages, so did she. Clara looked out her window into the Dublin night, the rain dripping down the glass like tears, and she wondered, When a place twists faith into cruelty, when prayers are offered not for salvation but for sacrifice, what kind of God answers? In history, some books survive because they are loved, others because they are feared. And then there are those that should never have been written at all. Clara Rowan found it pressed between volumes of Latin theology, its binding darker, its pages crackling with a dryness that seemed older than the rest. The title was in Latin, stamped in letters that had half flaked away Doctrina Ignis. The Doctrine of Flame. Her hand lingered on the cover. She had spent years in archives, but this felt different, not discovery, desecration. As if by opening it, she might let something breathe that had been buried for a reason. And yet she opened it. Inside, the author named himself Father Cormac of St. Brigid Set, servant of the divine will. The date 1831. 3 years before the orphanage would be described in the ledgers as an unfortunate tragedy. His words spilled in careful, deliberate script. They were not the raw mutterings of a fanatic. They were the polished arguments of a man who believed himself righteous. Water cleanses the body, but fire purifies the soul. Children born into abandonment carry the mark of rejection, the stain of original sin unredeemed by parental grace. It is not cruelty to purify them. It is mercy. A baptism beyond water, a baptism of flame, where flesh perishes, but the soul ascends unsullied into the hands of God. Clara read the lines aloud in a whisper, her throat dry. This was not a metaphor. It was instruction. Her mind reeled, yet she forced herself to read on. Father Cormac wrote of the unwanted, of the cursed innocence that tempts pity but hides corruption. He argued that orphans, having been forsaken by their earthly families, were already claimed by darkness unless the church intervened. And intervention, he wrote, must be absolute. Fire consumes doubt. Fire leaves no remnant of sin. Those taken in purity return not as burden, but as offering. Clara set the book down, heart pounding. She looked again at the ledger notes, the fires of purity, 127. This was not allegory, no warning. It was doctrine. And through the words she could almost hear him. Father Cormac. It is the year 1832. The chapel is heavy with smoke, candles flickering like watchful eyes. Father Cormac stands at the altar, robes black against the stone, voice rising and falling with practiced cadence. The nuns and brothers kneel before him. Brother O'Connell bows his head with rigid devotion. Sister Agnes sits near the rear, lips pressed thin, hands trembling in her lap. Cormac's words roll like thunder. Brothers and sisters, do not be deceived. The world tells us these children are to be pitied, but pity is weakness. Mercy is fire. The unwanted come to us tainted by the sins of their blood, but God has granted us the flame, and through it they may yet ascend cleansed. A murmur of assent ripples through the congregation. Some voices waver, but none speak against him. He lifts a candle, its flame swaying. Through fire we burn away what is unworthy. Through fire we return them to innocence. This is not death, it is salvation. The nun's eyes remain lowered. The brothers nod solemnly, and above in the dormitories, the children lie awake, listening to the cadence of words that make no sense but chill them all the same. That night, another bed is found empty. A girl named Brigid, barely 9, gone without a trace. Her small bundle of belongings vanished, her name unspoken at morning roll call. When the children whisper, Sister Agnes silences them, but her eyes betray something different, fear, not faith. She lingers in the chapel long after prayers, staring at the altar as though daring herself to approach it, yet she never does. Brother O'Connell, on the other hand, grows harsher. When a boy cries in the night for the friend who is gone, the strap falls across his back. Do not blaspheme God, says Will. O'Connell says, your friend has been taken by him. You should pray for the same. and the whispers deepen. The children now speak of the crypt beneath the chapel, of the glow that seeps from under its door at odd hours, of muffled cries that echo upward into the dormitory floors. They dare not say it too loud, for the last who spoke too much, the last who questioned was Kian, and his bed is still empty. Clara turned to the pages of Doctrine Ignis, her hands sweating through the thin gloves. The treatise grew darker. It contained not only argument, but ritual, descriptions of hymns altered into invocations, the use of incense to mask the scent of offering, the prayers to be spoken as the flame rose. Every line was both clinical and cruel. Father Cormac described flesh as if it were tinder. He wrote of souls as though they were smoke to be measured, tallied, released. Clara pushed the book away, bile rising in her throat. She had spent her career studying forgotten histories. She had read of famine, war, cruelty beyond measure. But this was something different. It was not chaos, not violence born of desperation. It was planned, rationalized, holy in its execution, sanctioned sacrifice. Her great-grandmother's face rose again in her mind, the sepia photograph of a girl whose eyes seemed too old, too hollow. Was she a witness, a survivor, or one of the 127? Clara's chest tightened. She tried to breathe, but the air itself felt poisoned, as if smoke had seeped through time to find her. She imagined the children lying in their narrow beds, listening to footsteps in the night, wondering if they would be chosen next. She imagined Sister Agnes's silence, her mouth pressed shut against a truth too terrible to name. She imagined Father Cormac at the altar, flame held high, convincing himself this was God's work. And she realized this was not an accident, not tragedy, not negligence. It was deliberate. Clara closed the book, but the words clung to her. They would never close. For once you learn that a church blessed the burning of children in the name of purity, can you ever again trust the prayers whispered in its walls? And so I ask you, when faith twists itself into fire, when innocence is laid upon the altar, do you still call it devotion, or do you call it murder? The year is 1833. St. Brigid's orphanage has stood a year longer, its walls no less suffocating, its shadows no less hungry. By now the children know what it means when a bed is left empty. They no longer ask aloud where their companions have gone, but in their silence their resolve begins to change. They cling to each other, not just as comfort but as shield. Secret pacts form in whispers beneath threadbare blankets, promises to protect one another. Promises not to speak too loudly, not to wander alone, not to cry out even when the fear is unbearable. For in this place, sound itself seems to betray them. Among these children are Aidan and Moira. Aidan, 12, sharp-eyed and restless. His defiance shows in the way he squares his shoulders, in the way he grips Moira's hand whenever Brother O'Connell passes too close. He has seen enough to know obedience is not survival. That survival depends on courage, and on silence when courage fails. Moira is younger by 2 years. Small, fragile, her body often trembling with fever or exhaustion. Yet there is something unshaken in her gaze. Where other children's eyes hold only fear, Moira's hold a strange light, not hope, exactly, but something quieter, something that endures. Her faith has not yet been stripped from her, not faith in the priests or the nuns, but in something deeper, something she cannot name. Together they are inseparable. Aidan calls her his shadow, though she shines far brighter than he ever could. It is Moira who first hears it. One night, long after the bells have gone still, long after the last candle has guttered, she shakes Aidan awake. "Listen," she whispers. He stiffens, ready for the sound of footsteps in the dormitory. But it is not footsteps. It is singing. Low, deep, almost like thunder rolling across stone. The sound seeps up through the floorboards, echoing faintly down the hallways. Not the hymns they are forced to learn, but something stranger, A rhythm too heavy, a melody too slow. The words are muffled, yet the children catch fragments. Ignis, puritas, essentio. Fire, purity. The locked chapel doors guard the source, but the sound leaks through the building like smoke. Other children begin to hear it too. They whisper of the voices, of the way the chant rises and falls like breath. Some swear they hear the crackle of fire between the words. Others say they smell smoke on their pillows when the morning comes. Aiden listens, jaw clenched, arm around Moira, as if he could shield her from sound itself. They set twist taking them down there, he mutters. That sets where Cian went. That sets where Brigid went. Moira says nothing, but the fear in her eyes tells him she knows he is right. And so Aiden makes a vow. He will escape. He will take Moira with him. The first attempt is small, a loose shutter in the dormitory window, pried open with stolen wire. But Brother O'Connell discovers it before the night is through. Aiden receives the strap until his back runs red, and Moira is made to watch. Do you see? O'Connell hisses. This is what comes of rebellion. This is how the devil tempts. The second attempt is bolder. A stolen key from the kitchen, smuggled under Aiden's mattress. But when he tries it against the dormitory door, it breaks in the lock. The noise brings the brothers running. The punishment is harsher. Moira is confined alone for 3 nights in the crypt's cold antechamber. Alone but not silent. For she swears she hears chanting even then, closer than ever before. The third attempt is desperate. Aiden and Moira hide in the laundry cart, hoping to be wheeled beyond the gates. But one of the nuns discovers them before they are out of sight. Moira's arm is bruised from the grip that drags her back inside. Each time the vow grows heavier. Each time Aiden feels his failure burning against his ribs, yet he does not give it up. For he knows the alternative. One night the hymn will call for Moira's name, and her bed will be empty. And through all of this, Sister Agnes watches. Her silence has always been her armor, but now it is beginning to crack. She sees the bruises. She hears the muffled cries. She notices the way Aiden shields his sister like a soldier, though he is barely more than a child himself. Late at night, in the privacy of her cell, Sister Agnes takes to her journal. Her handwriting trembles across the page, each entry a battle between fear and conscience. I was told this was a place of salvation. I was told we were to raise these children in holiness. But I see holiness twisted into something cruel. Brother O'Connell obeys Father Cormac as if his word were God himself. And Cormac, his sermons speak of fire, as though flame were a sacrament. I fear we are not saving souls. I fear we are feeding them to something that wears the mask of faith. She writes of the hymns that echo through the night, of the smell that clings even when no incense is lit, of the children's eyes, hollowing with each passing week. The church has confused salvation with slaughter, she confesses, and in our silence, we are complicit. Her words are never meant to be read. And yet, almost 2 centuries later, they will be Clara Rowan, hunched over brittle pages, feels the weight of Agnes's fear bleed across time. She can almost see the nun, candlelight trembling against her face, quill scratching furiously before footsteps in the corridor force her to close the book. Clara closes her eyes. She breathes in, as if expecting the air itself to smell of smoke. For in reading Agnes's testimony, Clara walks into the children's shadows. She feels Aiden's vow pressing against her chest. She feels Moira's fragile light flickering in the dark. She feels the chant swelling beneath the chapel, a hymn not to God but to fire. And she knows this was no place of refuge. This was a furnace. Her hands tremble as she turns the page, because she realizes what Aiden must have realized, that courage and love alone could not break the walls of St. Brigid. And so she asks herself, and by extension she asks you, if you had been a child in that fortress of stone, hearing the hymn of fire rise beneath your bed each night, would you still pray for salvation, or would you pray only to wake in the morning with your sister beside you? The first fire comes without warning. It eats through the dormitory wing as if the stone itself had been waiting for the flame. 7 children perished that night. Their screams, according to one surviving account, were muffled, not by smoke but by locked doors. The town records call it an accident, a misfortune of carelessness and poor wiring. But those who whispered in shadow alleys, those who listened to the stories of soot-covered orphans who ran barefoot into the night, knew better. The doors had been bolted from the outside. The fire had been planned. The surviving children understood then what none had dared speak aloud. They were not merely unwanted, not merely neglected by the church that claimed to shelter them. They were chosen for sacrifice. Among those survivors was a boy named Aidan. He was no older than 12, his frame thin, his hair falling in untidy locks across his brow. He had watched his closest friend burn, her hands clawing at the window until they broke like glass. From that moment, something inside him shifted. He swore he would not die in silence. He swore he would expose the truth, even if it meant bearing the same fate. But Brother O'Connell, the man who ruled the orphanage with iron rosary and leather strap, heard of Aidan's murmurs. He summoned the boy to his office, where the air smelled of wax and mildew, and the crucifix hung like a weapon above the desk. Those who resist the flame, Brother O'Connell said, invite worse than death. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of a promise. Aidan left that room with his fists trembling and his lips sealed, but his vow did not falter. The orphanage endured, its walls blackened by one fire, then another. Each time the parish insisted the children had perished by accident, by God's mysterious design, by the negligence of youth. And each time, the surviving numbers grew fewer. Years later, long after the orphanage had been abandoned, its stone bones sagging against the hillside, another figure began asking questions. A young historian who had dedicated herself to studying the forgotten tragedies of small towns, records that the church, and sometimes even the state, wished would fade into dust. She uncovered the coroner's reports of the fires. She expected clinical detachment, cold medical notes, nothing more than bureaucratic language. What she found instead unsettled her to the marrow. On bodies listed as burned beyond recognition, there were documented bruises, fractures, lacerations that spoke of struggle long before flame touched flesh. Children who should have suffocated in smoke instead bore marks of strangulation. The reports contradicted themselves openly. One boy with broken ribs attributed absurdly to a fall during the fire, though the boy's body had been found in his bed. Clara read the records by candlelight in the archive room, the silence so thick she felt it pressing against her skull. The deeper she went, the more the air grew suffocating, as if the past itself objected to her intrusion. But she continued. She found testimony from townsfolk, some unsigned, others scratched hastily in the margins of unrelated documents. They spoke of watching priests carry iron canisters into the dormitories days before each fire, of hearing hymns sung at midnight while smoke rose from the hill, of seeing children lined up outside the chapel, barefoot, their eyes wide with terror. And always, there were the bells. The orphanage bell would ring once, just before the fire began. Some said it was a warning, others believed it was a summons, a call for the consuming flame. Aidan's name appeared only once, in a ledger that listed children present after the second fire. No death date, no burial record, simply transferred. To where, no one could say. After that, he was gone. Clara's research drew her deeper into the mire. She spoke with the elderly, those who still remembered the smoke that painted the sky above the orphanage. One man, whose hands shook violently as he recalled, told her, "We heard the children at night. Not screams, not then. They were chanting words no child should know." Another whispered through rotted teeth, "Brother O'Connell never died. He was taken by the fire, but the fire did not consume him." Clara wanted to dismiss these accounts as superstition, but the contradictions of the coroner's notes gnawed at her. She began to dream of fire, not of burning buildings, but of fire with intent, fire that watched her, fire that whispered in a language of crackling wood and splitting stone. In those dreams she saw Aidan, or what she thought must have been him, a boy with eyes like smoldering ash, standing in a doorway that led nowhere. His lips moved, but his words were always drowned by the sound of a single bell tolling. The more Clara studied, the more reality seemed to unravel. Documents went missing from the archive after she read them. Pages she had marked with notes were torn out when she returned. And when she asked the parish for access to church records, she was told curtly that the orphanage had never existed at all. But the hill remained. The ruins stood there, their stone walls hollowed, their windows black as sockets. She climbed it once, against her better judgment, carrying the coroner's reports beneath her arm. The air reeked faintly of smoke, though no fire had touched the ground in decades. She touched the scorched stones, and her hand came away blackened as if the fire still lingered. Inside, the silence was unbearable. She whispered Aidan's name aloud, and her voice seemed to echo far too long for such a small chamber. And then, faintly, she thought she heard a reply. Not a voice, a cough, the sound of lungs struggling against smoke. Clara fled, leaving her papers scattered on the ground. Yet that night she dreamed again of the fire. Only this time she felt herself inside it, heat pressing against her skull, skin blistering. And in the dream, Brother O'Connell stood beside her, untouched by the flame, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. "Those who resist the flame invite worse than death," he whispered. Clara awoke screaming. But she could not stop. She returned to the archives, determined to piece together the final truth. She stitched the fragments into a timeline, fires set deliberately, children sacrificed in waves, their deaths masked as accidents, bruises hidden beneath ash, bones broken long before burning. The orphans were not victims of neglect. They were offerings. To whom, or to what, the records never dared say. Somewhere between the margins of history and nightmare, Clara understood what Aidan must have known. The orphanage had been a temple, the children its tithe, and the fire its god. And though the orphanage had fallen to ruin, the hunger of that god had not died. It waited, coiled in the charred foundations, patient as embers beneath ash. Clara's own obsession, her relentless search for truth, had marked her. For once you seek the fire seeks you. In 1834, famine gripped the Irish countryside like a clenched fist. Fields once golden with grain lay fallow, their soil cracked and exhausted. Mothers starved before their infants. Men wandered the roads skeletal and silent. In those days of despair, when hunger itself seemed a punishment from the heavens, Father Cormac found his pulpit swollen with authority. He preached not of mercy, but of penance. He declared before the parishioners of Bellevue that the hunger was God's chastisement for their sins, and that only fire could purify the land. The fires began small. At first, a ritual candle lit in the chapel, a symbolic flame offered as a plea for mercy. But as the famine worsened, so did the scale of his offerings. Father Cormac twisted scripture with ease, declaring that God demanded more than prayer, more than fasting. "The land drinks our blood, and so shall the Lord drink theirs," he whispered, words that would curdle in the marrow of anyone who truly listened. Few dared challenge him. Fewer still dared to ask who theirs meant, until the bells tolled. At midnight, their sound rolled across the hills, iron-throated and mournful. Each peal announced a name, though no one heard it aloud. The villagers only knew that come morning, one child from the orphanage would be missing. Always a child, always from those left unwanted, abandoned or orphaned by famine's cruelty. And yet, when bodies surfaced days later, smoldered in ash pits, blackened bone and cinder, Father Cormac declared it proof of God's deliverance. "The sacrifice preserves us," he thundered. "Ireland bleeds, but Bellevue endures. Within the convent, terror thrived. Children huddled in dormitories, clutching one another as the bells rang out their doom. Among them, Aidan emerged, not older than 12, but sharper in spirit than his years allowed. He was defiant where others trembled, unyielding where others wept. When the bells tolled, he whispered to the younger ones, "Hide beneath the floorboards, crawl into the crawl spaces, do not breathe, do not cry, let the flame starve for once." His voice, though small, became a rebellion against centuries of obedience. Yet rebellion has its witnesses. Brother O'Connell, gaunt and glass-eyed, pulled Aidan aside one night. "The flame is older than you," he murmured. "Older than famine, older than Bellevue. Those who resist the flame invite worse than death." His warning was not a threat, but a resignation. Brother O'Connell, like so many, had yielded to the inevitability of sacrifice. But Aidan refused. He gathered whispers like kindling. Secrets passed hand to hand in the dark. They would resist. They would survive. Not all shared his courage. Sister Agnes, frail and pale as a withered sheet, did not fight openly. Instead, she fought with pen and ink. By candlelight, she scrawled names into a hidden ledger, the children taken, the hours of their disappearance, the lies Father Cormac thundered from the pulpit. She knew she could not save them, but she would remember them. She would not let their names be devoured by silence. Each stroke of her quill was an act of rebellion, quieter, but no less potent than Aidan's defiance. The ledger became her covenant with the dead. Time thickened with dread. The famine deepened. The bells tolled. The smoke rose, and with each sacrifice the survivors grew thinner, both in number and in spirit. Yet through their suffering, a single question began to smolder. If the fires were meant to protect Bellevue, why did the hunger only worsen? Why did their bellies still rot with emptiness while their children burned? Generations later, Clara flipped brittle pages in a Dublin archive, her fingers tracing the names Sister Agnes had preserved. She had stumbled upon the ledger in a forgotten collection, misfiled, unmarked, as though history itself had tried to bury it. But Clara had the dogged instincts of an archivist who lived for the scent of missing fragments. Now she sat surrounded by coroner's reports, parish ledgers and newspaper clippings that told one story while concealing another. The official records spoke of fires, tragic accidents, kitchen embers gone astray, the hazards of wooden dormitories in dry seasons. The death counts varied, sometimes 5, sometimes 7, once even 13. Yet the coroner's notes, hastily scribbled and nearly illegible, contradicted every claim. Bodies listed as burned beyond recognition bore bruises across their skulls, ligature marks across their wrists, shattered ribs from beatings. Children who should have been swallowed by fire bore wounds from something else, something deliberate. Clara pushed the reports aside and rubbed her eyes. For weeks, she had consumed these documents, chasing fragments like crumbs on a darkened path. But the deeper she read, the more the narrative uncoiled into suffocating dread. At night she dreamed of the ledger. She dreamed of Sister Agnes's hand, ink blotting, names bleeding across parchment. She dreamed of children whispering from ash, their voices paper-thin but insistent. Sometimes they spoke her name. When at last she visited Bellevue, she found it not a place, but a wound. The orphanage stood in ruins, a skeleton of stone and weed. Walls collapsed inward like ribs around a hollow chest. The chapel's spire had toppled long ago, its bell absent from the tower. Yet the villagers she spoke to swore that on certain nights, especially when famine anniversaries came round, the bells still tolled. They swore that sound traveled across the fields, deep and hollow, as though time itself rang in mourning. One man, his face lined like cracked earth, leaned close when she asked. The bell was melted, melted, and buried with the bones. And yet, his voice fell to a whisper. And yet it rings, he would say no more. That night Clara walked the ruins alone. The air clung damp and sour with rot. Wind sighed through the blackened stone, carrying the suggestion of children's laughter, too faint to dismiss. She stood in the chapel's shadow, her lantern guttering, and for a moment she thought she heard the toll of iron. Low, heavy, sorrowful. She told herself it was the wind. She told herself it was her exhaustion. Yet when she checked her watch, the hands had just struck midnight. Sleep became impossible. Each night Clara dreamed of fire. Children with blistered faces reached for her through smoke, whispering, "Remember us, remember us." She awoke with the taste of ash on her tongue, her bedsheets tangled and damp as though she had clawed them in terror. Still, she pressed deeper into her research, though her colleagues warned she was becoming obsessive. History preserves what it wants. One archivist told her, "Some silences are deliberate. You dig too deep, you'll find nothing but madness." But Clara could not stop. She had seen the contradictions, she had read the names, and each night she heard the bells toll, not just in Bellevue, but even in her dreams, even in her bones. The story of Bellevue was not just famine, not just fire. It was a covenant written in ash and blood. Father Cormac had declared that Ireland could be spared through sacrifice, but Clara now knew what Sister Agnes had preserved. It was never Ireland that was spared. It was only Bellevue, and only for a time. Each child consumed in fire bought the village another season, another year, and when the sacrifices ended, so too did Bellevue. Its fields failed, its families fled, its church collapsed. What endured was only the memory, the echo of bells tolling across centuries, and perhaps something more. The famine year of 1834 stripped Belfield Orphanage of more than bread and warmth. It stripped it of trust, the invisible thread that had once bound the children together against hunger, against cold, against the priests who demanded obedience. That thread, once severed, frayed into betrayal. It was one of the older boys who broke first. His name was Killian, though few spoke it after. He had known too much hunger, too much cold, and when Father Cormac whispered promises of safety, food, blankets, protection from the flames, Killian yielded. The promise of survival was enough to blind him to the price. That very night, when Aidan whispered plans of escape to the others, Killian's ears caught more than words. They carried the scent of deliverance. And so, before the moon had set, he carried those whispers back to the priest. The bells tolled at midnight. Each peal meant another life stolen, another pyre raised to the heavens. That night, it was Moira who was taken. She did not cry out. She did not scream. She walked between the torches, her bare feet on the frozen stones, as though she already knew the betrayal had sealed her fate. Aidan tried to fight. He lunged, clawed, bit, wild with desperation, but the men who held him were larger, stronger, fueled by the righteous fury Cormac had planted in their hearts. They beat him until his defiance stilled, and then they dragged him to the cellar where no light seeped, no warmth lived. Shackles met his wrists. There he was left, his fury echoing in the stone. Above, Sister Agnes could bear no more. She had watched for months, recording the names in secret, hiding scraps of memory in her journal, while silence hollowed out her soul. But the night Moira burned, she broke. She went to Father Cormac in the vestry, where the shadows clung thick, and the smell of ash still clung to his robes. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, "Enough. End this. Have mercy." But Cormac's reply was unyielding, carved from the marrow of his fanaticism. He quoted scripture not as balm, but as weapon, twisting verses into chains. What burns here on earth will shine in heaven. To him the flames were no cruelty but a ladder, each child suffering a rung carrying the nation closer to salvation. Agnes saw then what she had long suspected. There would be no reasoning, no softening. The fire in his eyes was not holy, it was hunger, and so she resolved to act, even if it damned her. If God would not save the children, then she would. Her journal grew darker after that night. Clara, sitting in the ruins nearly 2 centuries later, traced the ink where Agnes's trembling hand had written, "I will resist, even if my soul burns beside them." It was in those final entries Clara discovered the truth, that it was Agnes alone who stood between Father Cormac and the total annihilation of the orphans. Without her, the pyres would have consumed all 127 children far sooner. But Clara could not shake the detail that lingered like smoke in her dreams, Moira's name written 3 times, underlined until the page tore. The night chosen for the end was not quiet, nor still. It came howling, a March gale that lashed the orphanage with sheets of rain and made the wooden beams groan as though the building itself foresaw its doom. The storm did not relent, instead it seemed to conspire with the madness of men, as if heaven and hell had struck a pact to bear witness to what was about to be done. Father Cormac called the children to the chapel. His voice carried on a bell that tolled through the night. Its peal was not the soft invitation of prayer, but the grim command of judgment. The orphans, thin, hollow-eyed, their hair clinging wet from the storm's spray, filed in with the weariness of lambs driven to slaughter. Some clutched each other's hands, others whispered fractured prayers they had been taught but no longer believed could save them. The air was thick with smoke already, though no flame yet touched them. For beneath the crucifix, where Christ's face gazed down in sculpted agony, wood had been piled high, pews broken and stacked, hymnals ripped and scattered, kindlings soaked in pitch. It was not a chapel now, it was a pyre. Father Cormac stood before it, robes black against the glow of flickering lamps. His face was rapturous, his eyes fever-bright, and in his hands he held the scripture from which he had carved their doctrine. His voice thundered above the storm. "Tonight, the heavens shall be opened. Tonight, the pure shall rise on wings of fire. What burns here on earth will shine in heaven." He stretched his arms wide, and the shadows of his figure lengthened monstrously against the chapel walls. The nuns stood behind him, their faces pale, lips pressed in silence. Most had surrendered to obedience long ago, crushed by years of doctrine and fear, but one remained unbroken. Sister Agnes. She moved quietly among the rows of children, her keys hidden beneath her habit. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm, not for herself but for them, for Moira, frail and coughing, for Aidan, whose eyes glowed with desperate defiance, for the scores of others whose names history would never speak. She whispered as she passed, low enough that only the children heard, "When the doors open, you run. Do not look back. Do not stop for the fallen. Run, children, and do not return." Aidan's hand found Moira's, his jaw clenched. He had dreamt of escape before, planned it in shadows, but now the moment was upon him, and with it, terror, for how could a boy fight fire or outrun the weight of holy madness? Yet he would, he must. Father Cormac raised a torch, flame writhing in the draught that seeped through the chapel sept's cracked glass. He proclaimed, his voice breaking with something between ecstasy and rage, "The great offering begins." He thrust the torch downward. The pyre ignited with a roar. Fire leapt skyward, licking the crucifix, devouring hymnals, sending sparks cascading across the chapel. Heat spread like a living beast, pressing against their faces, stealing breath from their lungs. The children screamed, some in prayer, some in terror. The storm outside thundered in answer, but its rain could not reach them here. Agnes acted. She slipped to the back, keys clattering softly, and flung the side doors wide. The gale rushed in, carrying with it a torrent of rain and the scent of freedom. She shouted above the roar of fire and storm, "Run, run, my lambs. God's mercy is not in flame but in flight." Chaos erupted. Children bolted, their bare feet slapping against stone, their cries piercing the night. Aidan threw Moira onto his back, her arms clutching his neck as he plunged into the crowd. The storm blinded him. rain and ash stinging his eyes, but he forced his way forward. Behind him, the chapel was an inferno. Father Cormac screamed for order, his voice a whip. Back, back to the fire, you faithless. He seized a boy by the collar and hurled him toward the pyre. The child vanished in flame, his shriek cut short. Others stumbled in terror, some too weak to resist, and were swallowed. The nuns wailed prayers, some falling to their knees, torn between obedience and horror. Agnes did not pray. She seized a fallen bench and drove it into the burning heap, toppling part of the structure so that beams collapsed between the children and the priests. The flames spread faster now, uncontrollable, searing through the roof. Aidan burst through the doorway with Moira clinging to him. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the courtyard in blinding white. He saw other children scatter into the storm, their figures vanishing into darkness. But he also saw those who faltered, small bodies trampled in the press, others dragged back by mad hands, still others swallowed by collapsing beams. The chapel groaned like a dying beast. The crucifix, charred and blackened, wrenched from its mooring and fell into the pyre. The fire reached the rafters. With a deafening crack, the roof began to cave. Inside, screams mingled with hymns. Father Cormac stood before the inferno, arms raised in triumph, his figure silhouetted against the blaze. His voice, hoarse but unyielding, cried out, "Let them rise, let their souls burn eternal." The roof collapsed. The storm drowned the night in sound, thunder, fire, shrieks, and the shattering of glass. Aidan stumbled into the mud, Moira gasping weakly against his back. Around him, scattered survivors sobbed, coughing up smoke. Sister Agnes staggered from the doorway, her habit-singed face blackened by soot. She fell to her knees in the rain, whispering a single line that none but Aidan heard. "Forgive me, Lord, for I have saved them against your will." And then she was gone, swallowed by falling timbers as the chapel collapsed inward, burying her in flame. By dawn, the storm was over. The orphanage lay in smoldering ruin, its stone walls cracked and blackened. The pyre had consumed nearly all of the 140 children who once filled those halls. Only a handful remained huddled in the woods, trembling in silence. 127 lives had been claimed. The church called it an accident. In the reports sent to Dublin, it was said that faulty lamps had fallen, that a storm had scattered flames too swiftly for salvation. No mention of doctrine, no mention of sacrifice. Father Cormac's words were buried with the ashes, his madness sealed away by silence. But Aidan remembered, so did Moira, and the few who had fled into the storm. They would carry the truth in their blood and bones that salvation had been demanded in fire, and that a nun who defied both priest and God had bought their lives with her own. The ruins of the orphanage smoldered for days. No bell tolled for the dead, no hymn was sung. The land itself seemed to recoil, as though unwilling to bear the memory of such sin. And yet centuries later, when the wind howls through the trees on storm-swept nights, villagers whisper they hear the echo of children's cries carried on the gale, the final chorus of the great offering. The fire ended in silence. That perhaps was the cruelest detail. A silence so complete, it seemed as though the night itself had colluded with the church, swallowing the screams, the prayers, the desperate clamor of children clawing at locked doors. When dawn rose over Kilmore in March of 1834, smoke still bled from the blackened stones of St. Audran's orphanage, but the world had already turned its gaze away. The church would call it an accident. The villagers would be commanded to forget, and those who survived would be erased, buried not beneath soil but beneath false names and altered records. The aftermath is rarely spoken of in accounts of great tragedies, but here it is perhaps more horrifying than the event itself. For death at least has finality. What followed was a scattering of lives, broken and silenced, designed to ensure that nothing remained. The doctrine of flame demanded not only sacrifice but obliteration, a cleansing not just of bodies but of memory. The surviving children, fewer than 24 by most whispered reckonings, were never allowed to remain in Kilmore. They were gathered under the trembling hands of Sister Agnes, smuggled into carts in the pre-dawn hours, and spirited away. But their salvation was short-lived. Church officials arrived swiftly, cloaked in authority and backed by threats of damnation. The survivors were absorbed into parishes across Ireland and beyond, their names changed, their origins erased. To neighbors and foster families, they were simply poor orphans from distant towns. Their scars, their fear of fire, their sudden cries in the night, these were dismissed as the common afflictions of poverty. No one spoke of the orphanage, no one was permitted to ask. Some would grow into adulthood under assumed names, bearing no trace of Kilmore in official records. Others vanished altogether, dying young or slipping into the underworld of poverty and labor. Clara, leafing through census rolls and parish lists nearly 2 centuries later, could trace faint lines where the names shifted suddenly, like seams hastily sewn to hide a wound. But beyond that, nothing. The children became ghosts while still alive, phantoms with beating hearts. And Sister Agnes, the one who had opened the doors, who had whispered "run" into the ears of trembling boys and girls, what became of her? Accounts diverge. Some say she was executed quietly, her death disguised as illness, a warning to others who might defy holy obedience. Others insist she was hidden away in a remote convent, her silence enforced by vows and isolation. Clara found no trace of her after 1834. In the church registers of Kilmore, her name was blotted out entirely, as though she had never existed. That absence felt louder than any entry. The ink itself betrayed the truth that someone had been erased with deliberate intent. Father Cormac's fate was more carefully arranged. He was not condemned, not even reprimanded. Instead, he was reassigned, quietly, seamlessly, to a parish far from Kilmore. His doctrine, the manuscript that had guided his madness, was locked away in the diocesan archives. To the outside world, he was merely another servant of the church, his sermons now filled with the usual rhetoric of obedience and devotion. Yet Clara suspected the doctrine of flame was not destroyed. Documents, she knew, were rarely discarded by institutions so obsessed with order. They were shelved, hidden, catalogued under benign titles, buried not by fire, but by bureaucracy. The villagers of Kilmore were given no such refuge. For them, silence was demanded, enforced by the gravest of threats. To speak of the fire as anything but an accident was to risk excommunication, a punishment that in rural Ireland of the 1830s was worse than death. To be severed from the church was to be severed from community, from livelihood, from salvation itself, and so they obeyed. They nodded when officials declared the fire the result of faulty oil lamps. They whispered prayers for the lost children, only within the privacy of their homes, never allowed in the streets. An entire town held its tongue, carrying the truth, like a stone pressed against the ribs. But truth does not dissolve so easily. Clara found it still lingering, generations later, in the pauses of elderly voices, in the hesitation before they spoke of 1834. Some shook their heads violently, insisting there was nothing to tell. Others wept without words. Silence itself had become an inheritance, passed from parent to child, as binding as blood. The village carried its trauma, like a shadow that refused to lift, even when all visible traces of the orphanage had long crumbled into ruin. And then there was the church's final weapon, the archives. The doctrine of flame was not shouted from pulpits after 1834. It was buried, classified as heresy, or perhaps too sacred to be understood by the uninitiated. Clara's research led her deep into catalogues where titles were coded in Latin, vague phrases masking the violence they contained. She could never be certain which leather-bound volume held Father Cormac's writings. Yet she felt their presence like heat rising through stone. It was there, behind those sealed doors, sleeping but never extinguished. The church had not destroyed it. They had simply hidden it from view, as though waiting for the right moment to call it forth again. For Clara, the weight of this absence was suffocating. To know that 127 children could be burned alive and then written out of existence, that was the true horror. Death, she could mourn. But erasure was endless. It was a second killing, repeated each time their names were not spoken, each time a page was turned and their story omitted. They had been sacrificed not once but twice, first to the flames, then to silence. And yet, the more she uncovered, the less alone she felt. It was not merely the documents or the whispers of villagers that pressed in around her. It was something else, something watching. In the archive's dim reading rooms, she would sometimes feel eyes upon her, a prickling at the back of her neck, the faint shift of air in places where no one moved. At first she told herself it was exhaustion, the product of long nights bent over brittle pages. But in Kilmore itself, standing before the blackened stones that still remained, the sensation deepened. She felt it in the chapel ruins, where the crucifix had once hung above the pyre. She felt it on the moors, where the orphans had fled into the storm. Always the same sense that she was not alone, that memory itself had taken form, refusing to remain buried. Perhaps it was only grief echoing across centuries. But Clara could not dismiss the possibility that something of those children lingered, that their silence was not their choice, but a cage, one she had stumbled upon and rattled loose. With every page she turned, with every name she resurrected from obscurity, she wondered, was she remembering them, or were they remembering her? Were they grateful or angry? The church had called it an accident. The villagers had called it unspeakable. But memory, it seemed, had another voice, one that reached out to Clara in ways beyond parchment and ink, one that whispered in the hush of ruined corridors and the low crackle of phantom fire. The doctrine of flame had demanded obedience through silence, and yet nearly 2 centuries later, that silence was breaking. What lingers when 127 voices are smothered? What shape does grief take when it is denied expression? Clara feared the answer, for it pressed upon her in every archive, every ruin, every dream. Something was watching, something was waiting, and it had not yet come to rest. Clara's return to St. Brigid's is not made in daylight. She chooses dusk, when the horizon bleeds into shadow, when the ruins of the chapel stand like a broken ribcage against the sky. Stones lie scattered, blackened by time and by fire, though no villager dares speak of what burned here. The silence of Kilmore is as heavy as its soil, and Clara knows she carries with her not only her own resolve, but the fragments of a buried truth. She steps across the threshold of the chapel, her lantern trembling against the damp air. The altar is little more than rubble, yet on it she places the tattered folio saved by Sister Agnes, the list of names. Each name, a child smothered by doctrine, erased by decree. Clara inhales, her voice unsteady, then begins to speak. One by one she recites them. The syllables are fragile, worn by centuries of suppression, yet they echo as though the walls themselves are straining to remember. With each name the air chills. Her breath smokes in the dim light, her fingers stiff with frost though no wind stirs. And then comes the sound, the unmistakable toll of the chapel bell. Not loud but spectral, each peal a hollow note ringing from nowhere and everywhere at once. Shadows begin to stir in the corners. Small figures, slight and indistinct, gather in the ruined nave. Children, their forms flicker like smoke, their silence absolute, yet their presence undeniable. They do not approach her, yet they surround her, filling the chapel with a density that feels both sacred and suffocating. Clara understands. This is not haunting for vengeance, but for memory. The children demand acknowledgement, a witness to their existence. Remembrance is the only release they have ever been denied. And so she continues, voice breaking, until the final name falls from her lips. But as silence returns, another force stirs. The air does not soften. It tightens, warps. The ground beneath her feet grows hot. The chill gives way to heat that sears, and the smell of ash thickens until it chokes her throat. The shadows waver, and for a moment she sees not the children but the fire that consumed them, the Doctrine, alive again, its flames not extinguished but waiting, slumbering until the moment someone dared to remember. Clara staggers, clutching the folio to her chest. She cannot tell if the children fade into peace or if they are consumed once more. All she knows is the fire is not gone. It is here, pressing against her, threatening to devour her too. The chapel seems to breathe with it, alive in its ruin, pulsing with a hunger that centuries of silence could not starve. And in that moment, Clara sees the terrible truth. To remember is to resist, but also to awaken. Memory is both salvation and curse. The church buried these children to smother their voices, but in calling them forth, she may have bound herself to their endless ritual. The bell tolls once more, low, final, and resonant. The shadows scatter. The lantern dies. Clara is left in darkness, with only the question burning inside her. Has she freed the children, or joined them?